the introduction is going to be appropriately brief because we want to hear the paper. This lecture is in conjunction with the first Human Capital and Economic Opportunity Global Working Group, a nice modest name, HCEO's first dissertation prize, which Eric Chyn won for Move to Opportunity. With reference to the award, I want to say two things. One, I think it actually was an honor because there was a number of extremely good dissertations that were submitted. So, having read them, I can speak with, I hope, with fair authority that it was not a relative. It was not just being first. It was really being first against some very, in the context of a number of impressive achievements. But I think the real honor goes to HCEO because as the inaugural winner of the award, what better way to start something like this and to have a wonderful piece of research done. I think as you will see, this is really very lovely empirical work, meticulously crafted and asking deep questions. And maybe, if I may say one final thing, avoiding tiresome methodological debates. In other words, this is a paper about questions and answers and doesn't worry about theology in terms of statistics. And so it's really a lovely piece of work, and I'm delighted to have a chance to hear it. Thank you, Eric, and congratulations.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Stephen. All right. Well, thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you all for coming to the lunch today and hearing about my paper. I'm tremendously excited to be here at the University of Chicago, and then being able to see everything going on at HCEO is super exciting. So, in this paper, the research question that I'm after is, how does growing up in a disadvantaged neighborhood affect long-run child outcomes? So what's the motivation for doing this project? Well, there are two things to note. One is that there are about 20 million children who live in high-poverty neighborhoods in the United States. And then two, many children's exposure to neighborhood poverty is being influenced by various government programs. In particular, the US government spends about $40 billion a year on different forms of housing assistance. And one of the most notable is project-based public housing, which gives you an apartment to live in. And then also there are Section 8 housing vouchers, which are subsidies that help families move to private market housing. Okay? And so if we want to know something about the costs and benefits of these different forms of housing assistance, we should try to learn about the effects that neighborhood poverty has on children. So what am I doing in this paper? Well, I'm going to be providing some new evidence on the long-run effects of neighborhoods by studying a natural experiment that occurred in the city of Chicago. So broadly, what am I doing? In my data, I'm going to be starting off in the public housing system in Chicago during the mid-1990s. And what's going to be happening is the housing authority is going to start destroying some public housing buildings and not others. The data is going to get divided up into two groups. One is a group of households and their children that are going to be displaced by these public housing demolitions. They're going to receive Section 8 housing vouchers to replace their assistance that they're losing. And then I'm going to also have a group of households living in public housing that are not displaced and they don't have access to housing vouchers at this time. Okay? And so really to preview what's going on in this research design and why you should think it's credible, you should be thinking about two public housing buildings just right next to each other. Okay, that's actually what's going on in the data. We've got two public housing buildings right next to each other, and the housing authority is going to decide to destroy one of these buildings for demolition. This one's going to go away, this one is not. And the motivation for these demolitions is that there are a lot of these buildings are in real rough shape. There are these idiosyncratic maintenance events that are going to be happening. A pipe breaks in the middle of winter. They're going to say, okay, let's select this building for demolition. Importantly, what I need to have happen here in terms of the research design is that I need these demolitions and this displacement to be unrelated to resident characteristics, okay? Because I want to use this group of the non-displaced households and their kids as the comparison group here. And so the basis for this research design and why it's credible is coming from some prior work by Brian Jacob in a paper from over a decade ago, where he was doing a short-run evaluation of these public housing demolitions and how it affected schooling outcomes of kids, okay? So I'm building on this work by Brian Jacob by doing a long-run evaluation of how these demolitions affected kids on labor market outcomes, arrests, a whole wide array of different things that happen for kids. And just another thing to sort of mention about the motivation for doing this project, this is the first long-run evaluation of public housing demolitions that I'm aware of using individual level data. And these public housing demolitions have been going on throughout the United States. So it's not just something that's specific to Chicago. Actually, nationally in most major cities, they've been demolishing their high-rise public housing. And so there's some broad interest in learning about these public housing demolitions because it was very controversial when they were doing this, and this is something we did across the United States. Okay, so the preview of the results. So again, I'm going to be comparing these children who were displaced due to these public housing demolitions to their non-displaced peers. Children displaced due to these demolitions, they're going to move to areas with lower poverty and less crime. Okay, this is not surprising because they're living in high-rise public housing in these areas which were some of the worst neighborhoods to grow up in the United States. These are extremely high poverty, very high crime areas, okay? And so they get displaced from those buildings, they move using Section 8 housing vouchers, and it's not totally surprising that they are getting to better areas. And then looking at them in the long run, looking at these displaced kids, I find that they have notably better labor market outcomes, okay? They're more likely to be working as adults, and they have higher annual earnings when they are working. So positive effects on labor market outcomes. And then also, there are reductions in violent crime arrests for displaced kids. And we care a lot about this because violent crime is very socially costly. So contributions here, I'm showing that in the long run, these demolitions helped improve outcomes for the average child living in low-income public housing. And more generally, this long-run evaluation is showing these positive effects despite a lack of short-run effects. So in the previous work that I mentioned by Brian, he actually didn't find any detectable evidence that these public housing demolitions affected schooling outcomes. No effect on test scores, et cetera, things like this. Okay? This long-run evaluation is showing impacts on these other different dimensions that we really care about. Okay? And this pattern of finding long-run effects, despite the lack of short-run effects, has been seen in other evaluations of different government programs. And so a general takeaway, not only from this paper, but also the literature, is that we need to complement evaluations that are looking at short-run outcomes with looking at things in the long run. All right, so now I'm going to get into the heart of the talk. I'm going to give you more information about institutionally what's going on. Really try to give you more information to try to convince you that this is a credible natural experiment. I'll go over the results, and then finally I'll conclude with some more discussion to give you a way to think about these results, how they fit in with the literature, and what they mean for policy. All right, so public housing. Let me tell you a little bit about that first. So this is a federal government program where the goal is to provide decent housing for low-income families. The form of this assistance is going to be that you're going to get an apartment in a large residential building. Okay, these apartment buildings, they're high rises, they're very tall, they have lots of units in the high-rise public housing building. And in terms of the terminology, these buildings, a collection of them is going to be called a housing project. They're going to be built really close together. And so the collection of all those buildings is the housing project. And while this is a program that's federally supported, it's going to be owned and operated by a local city authority. So an entity in Chicago is actually operating public housing, okay? So give you an idea of what this looks like, here's a photograph of the Robert Taylor Homes public housing project in Chicago, right? And what you see in this picture is, over here, you see this collection of high-rise apartment buildings here. This is public housing, right? They're all pretty close together here. You see some more public housing down here as well. All right, so that gives you a sense of how close these buildings are together. All right? Public housing in Chicago. So this was the third largest public housing system during the mid-1990s. That's when I'm studying this. And households are very poor. Average household income was about $7,000. Living in this public housing was very crowded. About 20% of units had more than 5 people living in them. And nearly all residents at this time are African American. That's going to be my sample, African Americans.
Where do you get the income data from?
Oh, so this is just a statistic from the Chicago Housing Authority, like aggregate. Like they said in the mid-1990s, this is their average income of households. I am going to be studying a lot. I'm going to have some unemployment insurance records for my analysis, but that's just taken from their sort of official numbers.
How should we think about the selection of the public housing versus Section 8?
I think, so at this time, during the mid-1990s, Section 8, my understanding is that they hadn't issued Section 8 housing vouchers for over a decade. They had sort of closed the Section 8 housing voucher list in some point in the mid-1980s, and they hadn't been issuing them because they just didn't have funding for it, et cetera, like that. So no one had really been selecting into it. I think in general, one thing to mention about public housing, and this is true of Section 8 housing vouchers as well, is these programs have long waiting lists. So there's much more demand for these programs than there is supply of either of these things. So they're both highly coveted. I think that typically, when you look at households that are in public housing relative to households that try to get a housing voucher, they typically are probably negatively selected. Yeah. But at this time, Section 8 housing voucher stuff wasn't really going on because the waiting lists had been closed for so long. Okay. So why did Chicago start to demolish its public housing? Well, as I mentioned earlier in the preview of the research design, this is a reaction to serious management and infrastructure problems. So these buildings had been built in the 50s and 60s very cheaply, okay, all basically at the same time. And by the mid-1990s, these buildings are really crumbling and falling apart, okay? They're in very poor shape. And so few in the city, the mayor, et cetera, policymakers, believed that the housing authority was really up to the task of dealing with these severe maintenance issues. Scandals over time had revealed that the housing authority had mismanaged public funds. And so there was, by the mid-1990s, just a lack of faith in their ability to manage infrastructure problems, in addition to the fact that public housing throughout the city was a very high crime environment. It's a very big eyesore for the city. Newspaper articles are always talking about crime in public housing projects. So this is something that city policymakers were very concerned about. It was a major policy issue. And now they're sort of getting fed up with the housing authority. And so at this point, they're going to start proposing public housing demolition and expanding voucher assistance. Okay? They're going to voucher out the public housing projects. And an important key point here is that they're going to have limited funding for this policy change. All right, so there are tens of thousands of families living in this low-income public housing across the city of Chicago, and they don't have enough money to do all the demolition and come up with these new vouchers all at the same time. Okay? And so this limited funding is important, and as noted by Brian in his original work, this is going to lead to selection of public housing buildings based off of specific maintenance issues that come up, okay? So you're going to have some sort of crisis, for example, like a pipe breaks in the middle of winter in one Robert Taylor Homes high-rise building. That's going to cause the whole heating system to go out. A housing authority is going to say to themselves, we would have to at least temporarily relocate all the residents because no one can live in the middle of winter in Chicago without a heating system. Okay, so they know they at least have to do a temporary relocation of people. And so instead of doing that, they know they have this sort of grander ambition of getting rid of all the public housing in the system. They say, well, we're going to start with this building. We're going to make this a permanent relocation of these residents. Give them vouchers, shut this building down, destroy it. And there are other Brian sort of documents other sort of cases like this where you had this sort of idiosyncratic stuff going on where certain buildings were being selected for demolition, okay? And to the best of, I'll show some more evidence of this later, but to the best of what we think is going on here is that the housing authority was not saying, hey, we're going to select this building for demolition because, we don't like those particular residents for whatever particular reason, okay? This is really revolving around these maintenance issues. So here's an illustration of this process of public housing demolition in the city of Chicago. And so what we're seeing here in the foreground, so this is Stateway Gardens public housing project. And what we see here in the foreground is a building in the process of being demolished, right? This is, half of the public housing high-rise is left. half of it's been destroyed in the next couple days. They're going to take down the rest of the building here. This is where I'm getting my treatment group here. I'm going to be looking for the households that were displaced by this public housing demolition. Okay, and I'm going to be looking at their kids in particular. So what happens to these residents from these demolished buildings? Well, they're provided Section 8 housing vouchers, and they're compensated for their moving costs. Important to note here is that vouchers and project-based assistance have the same rules, so there's no additional sort of taxes or rent requirements, whatever, going on with switching people over to the voucher program, okay? So the people's budget sets aren't changing as a result of this program. And then, this is a little bit of a preview of the data, but just to get this in your minds early on, households are going to be moving to lower poverty areas. And so what I'm doing here in this figure is I'm looking at address information for households who are displaced and not displaced by these public housing demolitions 3 years after a demolition occurs. Okay, so I track down all the displaced households 3 years after the demolition. I look at the address and then what's the poverty rate at that address. And then I'm plotting these densities for the neighborhood poverty rate for the two different groups. So over here, this is going to be a high poverty neighborhood. And then we're going to have low poverty neighborhoods in this direction. And what you can see here is the density of neighborhood poverty rates for the displaced households is shifted to the left relative to what we see for the non-displaced households here. Okay, so on average, the displaced households are moving to lower poverty areas, right? And we see this sort of mass point here for the non-displaced households. These households, 3 years after demolition, are still living in their high-rise public housing, mostly. All right, you do see some sort of leak out in terms of this comparison group. The non-displaced households, some of them on their own, are choosing to move out of public housing and into lower poverty areas. But on average, you have this sort of first stage where you do see that displaced households are moving to lower poverty areas relatively more. Okay, and just to be clear here, these non-displaced households, all the buildings I'm using to find these households, none of them were destroyed for at least 6 years, if not longer, after the original wave of demolitions I'm studying. Okay, so they're not being forced out themselves, mostly. Okay. So now the research design, so let me show you the specification I'm actually using here. I'm going to be just running this simple regression where I take some outcome y for kids after they've grown up. Okay, so this is going to be, I observe them when they're age 25 or whatever. Are they working or not? What are their earnings, et cetera? Okay, that's a dependent variable here. And then I'm going to be regressing that on this right-hand side over here. Okay, so what's going on the right-hand side? Well, the key thing here is going to be this beta coefficient, estimates of this. And that's coming off of this dummy variable d, which is an indicator for whether or not somebody was living in a building that was destroyed by these public housing demolitions. Okay? And then the rest of the regression, so I can include baseline covariates here for someone's individual household. This actually doesn't matter at all for the point estimates, don't move at all, doesn't affect inference. In theory, sometimes including these covariates helps with precision, but in practice, for my analysis, this matters not at all. And that's not going to be surprising because I'm going to show you that these x's are going to be balanced, okay? The rest of the regression, what we have here is this term, which is a set of project fixed effects here, okay? So there are different housing projects. There are 54 buildings here, and there are different housing projects throughout the city. And what I want to be doing here is making sure that I'm making these very local comparisons. Again, the sort of spirit of this research design is that I've got two buildings right next to each other. This one goes, this one doesn't. Okay, I want to compare these individuals because these residents are very similar to each other, right? I don't want to be comparing, someone who is living in one part of Chicago in a low-income housing project to someone living on another side of Chicago that may be in a project that is a little bit better off than this particular project on the sort of like the south side or something like that, right? So I want to use these project fixed effects to make sure I'm making very local comparisons of kids. And within project really is where I'm getting this identification from, okay? So I'm using these project fixed effects here for part of the research design. This matters a little bit, so the point estimate changes a little bit when we don't include that. That's because different public housing projects had different amounts of public housing demolition, and the projects themselves, while all being very disadvantaged, are a little bit different from one another. Some of them are a little bit worse shape in terms of at the project level. Okay, then I'm going to have these year fixed effects here, this delta t term here. That's going to help with precision a little bit. Again, the results are robust, basically just regressing this on the dummy variable. But to get a little bit more precision, I include that, right? And again, the whole idea of this design is I'm making these local comparisons within project.
Did you consider allowing the thetas to depend on in other words, the idea here is that the
right, yeah.
demolition effect is added at the sociological perspective would be hierarchical.
Right. And I have various sort of supplemental regressions that do those type of interactions, and I really usually don't see a lot of heterogeneity by x for the treatment effect. So these x's that I have don't really do very much in terms of predicting treatment effects.
So one thing I didn't appreciate was, so age is part of x?
Yeah, age. Yeah, I mean that, again, that's mostly for precision because everything is like balanced on baseline age across the.
Well, I'm thinking of the issue of heterogeneity. In other words,
yes.
If you move at 15, it's different than you move at 8.
Exactly, yeah, and I have some various sort of, more interaction regressions which allow me to sort of get at that. I'll go into the specifications in a little bit, yeah. Okay, but this is the main specification. Just looking at all the kids, regardless of their age, et cetera, and running this regression. Okay, so threats to identification. Well, the main concern that you should have in your mind already, which I've already tried to sort of dispel, is that the displaced and non-displaced residents are different. The identification argument here is both historical and statistical. So the thing I've been telling you about is that the Chicago Housing Authority selected buildings with maintenance issues, not based on specific resident characteristics. They're not going to one particular building because they're saying like, oh, these people in this building are so bad, let's just get rid of those people. Another sort of institutional detail to keep in your mind here is there are these long waiting lists for getting into project-based public housing, okay? And so you're on this waiting list, you wait for years until your name comes to the top of the waiting list. And then once you get to the top of the waiting list, you get an offer of an apartment unit, right? And if you decline that offer, you go to the bottom of the list. So you have this strong incentive to take the first unit available to you, all right? And so there's limited ability to sort of like scarcity and rationing of spots in the public housing system is implying that there's going to be limited ability for people to like, oh, hey, I don't want to live in that building. I would rather live in this building. That's going to be very challenging to do. Okay, so the historical context implies that there's limited ability to sort across buildings within a project, which is where I'm getting identification from. And then also, as Brian noted in his original work, that the housing authority is not destroying these buildings specifically because of, oh, they are targeting a particular group of people in one building. And then second, consistent with this historical argument is, I can look at baseline characteristics to test for differences between non-displaced and displaced adults, children, et cetera, right? Okay, and so I do a lot of different balance tests here in the paper. This is just to give you a flavor of one of these. What are we looking at here? Well, I'm focusing on adults living in public housing, okay? This is just all adults, just giving you a sense of what are overall conditions like between these two different buildings. And then using the sample of 4,300 adults living in these public housing buildings, I'm looking at various baseline characteristics for them. So this is all things about people before the public housing demolitions started, okay? So each row is a different individual characteristic. In this column, what I'm showing you is the mean for people in the buildings that were not destroyed, the non-displaced group, their means, okay? So on average, a non-displaced adult is, 29 years old, all right? And then what I'm showing you over here in this column is running that prior specification I showed you, but I'm putting these baseline characteristics as a dependent variable, right? This is just a standard balance test. So what you see here is, on average, the displaced adults are, about a year older. So, that is a detectable difference there. It's a little bit hard to think of a story precisely that, 1 year of age difference amongst these adults really matters. And more reassuringly, what you look at when you see this balance table is that, for measures of past arrests, okay, there's no evidence that individuals who were displaced, these adults that were displaced, were more likely to have any form of arrest. Okay, they're not more likely to have criminal activity in their past. And then the same balance test ends up looking pretty good for the labor market activity as well. Okay? And this is all from the administrative data I have. And so this is the balance test for the adults. I could do subgroups looking at just the parents, males, females, et cetera. One thing to note, the sample is overwhelmingly female. That is not surprising. Okay? So the priority for getting into the way the housing assistance priority queues work is that if you are a single female with kids, you will be given priority on the waiting list. Okay, and so most of these are going to be women just with their kids in the data. All right, but there are some men here, 13%. All right, and then I do these balance tests also for kids, and that looks good. Just as a note, sort of Brian's original work was using the schooling data and just looking at the kids. That was his only sort of way to get information about displaced and non-displaced people. And the balance test looking at schooling outcomes also looks quite good. Okay, so across a range of different outcomes that you could look at in terms of baseline characteristics, this natural experiment setting comparing displaced and non-displaced individuals, these two groups really look very similar. I mean, we're really gone through an exhaustive search of looking through different things that could be different and don't find detectable evidence of that. All right, so with that in mind, there are other sort of concerns for the interpretation of my analysis. I talk more about them in the paper. I don't want to spend too much time talking about them. I do just want to acknowledge, in case people have this in their mind, thinking about attrition may matter here. I'm using a lot of state administrative data. I think the best answer that I can come up with is that I don't think attrition is a big deal. I do tests for differential attrition for people moving out of the state of Illinois. I lose them in my sample if that happened. I don't really see any evidence of that. So I don't think attrition is a big deal in this paper. So with that in mind, getting on to the main analysis. So again, I want to just characterize what this first stage is. These demolitions forced these households out. It gave them housing vouchers. How did neighborhood characteristics change? I showed you that they moved to, on average, lower poverty areas. Well, here are some more characteristics about the neighborhoods 3 years after demolition. This first row here is just telling you about the likelihood that I see a household having an address. The address information comes from social assistance case files. Okay, so this is also a test of whether or not you're on. So the household is on social assistance 3 years after demolition. And you see that there's no detectable difference between the displaced and non-displaced households in terms of being on social assistance and having an address, right? So it's, almost 80% of them still show up in the assistance data 3 years after demolition. And so that's good. That means that we can go forward with looking at analysis of neighborhood impacts on these households and their kids. And so for these households, what you see here is, okay, neighborhood fraction black. You don't see a lot of change here. So the non-displaced group is living in areas that are about 95% African American, and then there's this small but detectable reduction in the fraction of the neighborhood black for the displaced group. All right, this is not totally surprising. These households, there are a lot of studies looking at sort of discrimination in housing markets that suggest that it's very hard for low-income African-American families to be able to use housing vouchers. There's an audit study that shows pretty compelling evidence that landlords have lower response rates when people say that they're African-American and they want to use a Section 8 housing voucher. And so there's a lot of challenges with moving for these households, and so they tend not to move to racially diverse neighborhoods. And also they have preferences, so maybe they prefer to live in sort of high fraction African-American areas as well. But in contrast to the lack of sort of impact on racial composition, you do see big effects on these other dimensions of neighborhood characteristics. Okay, you see this effect of a 13 percentage point reduction in the percentage of your neighbors that are below the poverty line for the displaced group. And then in particular to me, you see this very large reduction. This is, like a 30%, not quite a 30% reduction in the violent crime rate in their new neighborhoods for the displaced group. So they are really getting to areas that are safer in terms of violent crime. Yes?
What are we defining as a neighborhood here?
So this is, this is census tract, which is sort of typically what people use to say, like, that's a neighborhood. I mean, it's a convenient definition here.
How many people live in a census tract in Chicago?
Oh, yeah. So I actually, off the top of my head, I think it's thousands. I cannot actually specifically remember like what the max or minimum number is.
What would the numbers look like for HCEO?
In terms of these like first stage impacts? So in terms of first stage impacts, shortly after sort of moving, so the question is about one of these previous studies looking at moving to different neighborhoods. And in this previous study, they provided people with Section 8 housing vouchers. Actually, this previous study had 2 different treatment arms in it. And this previous work gave people unrestricted, regular Section 8 housing vouchers, which are the same thing that my sample is getting. And in that sample arm, these numbers are comparable there. These don't look tremendously different from the unrestricted MTO voucher arm. They do look different from this other study had this sort of super experimental voucher arm where people got housing vouchers which could only be used in very low poverty areas, and that has a much bigger first stage. So much bigger changes in neighborhood environment in one of the treatment arms in MTO. Yeah.
What about the controls on the two?
In the control, like just what the control means are? Yeah, no, the control means are going to be, Chicago is definitely going to have higher, people in general are going to be living in higher poverty environments in the control group in Boston, in Baltimore, et cetera. So the control means here are way higher for Chicago than MTO. All right, so now turning to this long run analysis, looking at the impacts of getting to these better neighborhoods. Okay, this is adult labor market outcomes. So I'm looking at kids between their age 19 to whatever age is the last age I see in my sample. My sample goes up to my data goes up to 2010, and so I think I'm following some kids up to age 32. Other kids not as far. It just depends on how old you are when demolition was happening. And so what I'm looking at here is I'm looking at different measures of these adult labor market outcomes. Each row here is a different outcome. So this is just an indicator for whether or not you were employed. Here's earnings, here's conditional earnings. And again, we're looking at the non-displaced group, these kids, what are their means. And then we're looking at treatment effects here, the impact of demolition, okay? This is the beta coefficient from the regression. So this is just all kids, okay? Regardless of how old they were. And so what you see here is there's this positive impact. There's the kids who are displaced by the public housing demolitions, they're about 4 percentage points more likely to be employed as adults. Okay, so that's like a 10% roughly impact on the likelihood of working. And then you also see these big effects also on earnings, okay? Big relative to the non-displaced means, right? And so overall picture is it's looking pretty positive for looking at these people as young adults and seeing some positive evidence of effects on their long-run labor market outcomes.
Those are annual earnings, $3,000 only, $3,700.
Yeah, this is 3,000 in annual earnings. 3,700. Yeah, it's low. Yep. I mean, this is including all the zeros for people who aren't working. Yeah. Okay. All right. So what? Oh yeah. Go ahead.
Data is from where?
Oh, so this is from unemployment insurance records, which have the quarterly earnings data.
This is W-2.
Yeah, this is what they report to the Illinois Department of Employment Security. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Did you have another?
Oh, so so if someone moves to like Wisconsin, they're
Yeah.
zero.
Yeah, there's just a zero in the data, right? Yeah. So this is
That's going to be an underestimate of the true
treatment effect.
Well, they moved to
of the true average earnings.
Yeah, true average earnings for sure.
Because anyone that leaves a state is going to be put in as zero in the data.
Yep, that's exactly. Yeah, and the concern there, is using any form of administrative data, state level administrative data, is people move out of the state, and then you're putting in zeros for them. You're very concerned about that if that's differential across treatment and control groups. That's like a big concern. I do a variety of tests for that. That never comes up as an issue. I think more generally, there's some previous research looking at low-income households in Chicago and doing a lot of work to try to track these households down, like paying companies to like figure out where people are living over time. And these households, I think one statistic that I've seen is that 10 years after sort of looking at people, like tracking people for 10 years, you can find sort of 90% of people living in Chicago who are like super low income. They just tend to not move out of the city. Yeah.
So if someone moves out of the state, you wouldn't have an address for them, right? So
I wouldn't have an address. Yeah, they'd be
dropping them in the sample, or you include them as zeros as moved over?
including them as zeros. Yeah. Okay, so this is one of the other extensions in terms of the empirical specification that Stephen brought up was looking at effects by age. Okay, so one thing I'm going to do to try to get at this is just divide the data into two groups of individuals: kids who are relatively young when they moved, and then kids who were older when they moved. All right, and the age groups I'm going to be using here are going to be based off of some work by this other very famous paper looking at neighborhood effects. They really focus on young kids versus older kids, and they're defining things sort of around age 13. So all of my kids that are going to be between age 13 and 18 when they were affected by demolition, I'm going to call that the older group. And then kids underneath age 13, I'm going to be calling the younger group of kids. Okay? And so what I'm going to be doing in a specification is just taking these two different groups and estimating treatment effects at different ages. All right, so what's that going to look like? So what I'm doing here is looking at effects on annual earnings, and I'm running a regression where I have these interactions between the age that you are in that year that I'm observing you, and then whether or not you were displaced or not, right? So right here what we see is this is comparing two people who are age 19, comparing a displaced child to a non-displaced kid. And what's the difference in their earnings? Okay, so this is actually, the y-axis here is scale is quite large. So this is actually several $100s, right? And what you see here is that as these young kids, this is the group of kids who are below age 13 at the time of demolition, the young group only. And what you see here is that there's this trajectory of these treatment effect estimates, okay? You see that they start going up right after age 24. Okay, so at age 25, and in particular age 26, these numbers are getting very big. All right, I put the confidence interval here on here to be totally transparent. This is a really taxing regression, okay, because I'm trying to estimate treatment effects at each individual point in terms of age, right? But if you were to just sort of pool all these different, if you were trying to just estimate a treatment effect for the young group as a whole, not at each particular age, you would get a significant effect, all right? But this gives you a sense of the trajectory of these benefits. Okay, so for young kids, these treatment effects seem like they're getting bigger over time. That's actually consistent with some prior research some of the most recent research looking at neighborhood effects, which is showing that young kids really benefit from moving to lower poverty areas, okay? And so for older kids, what do I find? Well, I'm running the same type of regression here, and this is the kids who are between ages 13 and 18 at the time that demolition happened. And what you see here is you still get positive effects, again, not significant, but there's no clear trajectory here, okay? But again, these are several $100s. And if you were to run the less taxing specification, just sort of estimating an average effect for the older kids, you would get a statistically significant effect, okay? So there's some evidence that both older and younger kids benefit, but the trajectory of benefits is really increasing for the younger kids here. And in particular, so if you're just focusing on age 26 earnings, okay, the point estimate here is 3,000, okay? And the point estimate here for the older kids is about 400, right? And, if you actually test whether or not these 2 point estimates are different, you actually will, I think it's like 0.09 p-value, reject that these are equal. So it does look at these, like there is some heterogeneity in terms of relocation on some of these effects of relocation by age. Okay. All right, so getting into some more, a different dimension of impacts of moving to a better neighborhood. This is looking at this arrest data and running the same model as before, and now we're looking at different measures of arrest, total arrest, violent crime arrest, et cetera. The big thing to mention here is that we see that there's this reduction in, this large reduction in the probability of having an arrest for violent crime, okay? You do actually see that there is this impact on property crime arrests, and that's actually, this positive impact here, increasing property crime for the displaced group. That's actually consistent with some prior research looking at neighborhood relocation programs, which show that moving families out of low-income public housing, sometimes you'll see these effects on property crime. Okay. So, sort of to provide a little bit of discussion about how these results fit into the literature, as I sort of mentioned a little bit already, because this came up, was there's an extremely well done social experiment looking at the impact of neighborhoods on kids. It's called the Moving to Opportunity Program, and that gives us some prior evidence to look at, to think about how these demolition estimates sort of fit in with the literature. And the key thing here is that in both this social experiment, MTO, and then this demolition context, people are getting Section 8 housing vouchers. So one thing I want to do is just compare what I find to the regular unrestricted vouchers in the MTO experiment. MTO had 2 treatment arms again. I'm just going to look at the treatment arm that's most similar to mine, and I'm going to be focusing in on their study from 2011, which is the sample of their data that is like most comparable in terms of the age profile of observing kids. So this is sort of what I think is one of the best comparisons for thinking about the demolition analysis I'm doing because the sample is very similar here. The treatment in particular is just regular Section 8 housing vouchers. And what you see here, what I'm doing is I'm giving you these box and whisker plots for treatment effects. And so this is going to be the effect on employment, the likelihood of working. And in the demolition sample, that was a 4 percentage point detectable increase in the probability of working. In the Moving to Opportunity regular unrestricted treatment arm in a 2011 report, what they get is actually a negative point estimate here that is not precisely estimated. All right, that's why the whiskers here, the 95% confidence interval, and they cross 0. Right? So you do get, this contrast between the demolition analysis and then the regular treatment arm of Moving to Opportunity. For earnings, you do also see a contrast here. I'm getting these positive detectable effects on earnings right here for all the kids affected by demolition. And then in Moving to Opportunity, just the regular Section 8 treatment arm, you get this very, imprecisely estimated impact here. You really can't, if you do a test to try to see if these 2 point estimates are different, you can't say a lot just because the standard errors here are so large. But doing a test here is suggestive that these point estimates actually are different. Okay, so there is a contrast between what I find in this demolition analysis and then one part of the literature, the unrestricted treatment arm in the Moving to Opportunity project. So this is different than what we knew from that previously. Okay, so thinking a little bit about how these estimates fit in across the different studies, in particular thinking about my work looking at public housing demolition and then this Moving to Opportunity experiment. There's also some other work looking at public housing in Canada. Phil Oreopoulos is a great paper looking at that. So all of these sort of points sort of apply to this. Like, why could I be finding some different effects than what other people found in other papers? Well, one thing is, we have some differences in relocation behavior. Displaced households and in the demolition context and MTO movers, they both move to lower poverty neighborhoods, but you're really moving from extremely disadvantaged environments in in the Chicago demolition context. Okay, so even though you do see a sort of first stage in either context, you know, the places they're moving from, the counterfactual is a little bit different here in the demolition context. That's sort of one thing. You know, again, you know, that sort of relates to saying that this is just a different sample. All right. Another sort of thing to note is, you know, I'm studying a very general sample of public housing children. The previous work that I mentioned, you know, this MTO work, is studying a group of people who are very motivated to move out of public housing. Okay, and I'm looking at people who are being forced to move regardless of their motivation. Okay, so maybe we think there's some treatment effect heterogeneity with that could be correlated with your demand for moving. Maybe that's a reason why you would see some treatment effect heterogeneity. And then finally, you know, another reason why I could be getting some differences in effects is that demolition is just a very different treatment. I mean, demolition is a different treatment, you know, partly because of the setting. It's different in Chicago. Demolition also has some different properties. You know, demolition is destroying whole buildings. Maybe it has larger impacts on social networks and social ties relative to some of these other interventions we studied before. And maybe that could be a reason why you see some different impacts from demolition. All right, so summary and conclusion. So I actually finished a little bit ahead of myself. You know, overall, this paper, the main takeaway is that demolition provided additional evidence that moving to better neighborhoods can have a long-run impact on child outcomes. This is really lining up well with recent work by Raj Chetty and several co-authors, Nathan Hendren, Larry Katz, et cetera. And it's really, you know, I think we've learned a lot about neighborhood effects just within the recent past, and that's changed our thinking about how neighborhoods matter. And in particular, one of the results that I sort of tried to highlight in my own analysis is this heterogeneity, this apparent heterogeneity in benefits by the age at which children move. Okay, and this finding that children who are young when they're moving seem to be benefiting is suggesting that, you know, the length of exposure to a better neighborhood is really important to think about here in terms of these mobility interventions, okay? And you know, you see that in the demolition analysis, and that's also what you know, Raj Chetty and Nathan Hendren and Larry Katz show in one of their recent papers as well. Policy implications. So you know, more generally, why you would care about this study and its results? Well, it sheds light on a debate over the merits of expanding voucher programs. So there is still project-based public housing in the United States. We have expanded voucher programs quite a lot. And we should know something about, you know, sort of the trade-off between project-based public housing, maybe doing more demolitions in the future, and voucher programs, which are what we're using to replace those things, okay? In the paper, I give some details about this, but just to sort of provide a sort of quick overview, if you do some simple sort of back-of-the-envelope calculations about how much is the lifetime earnings gain from getting somebody out of project-based public housing and then giving them a Section 8 housing voucher and using the treatment effects I estimate here, you're going to get a number, which I think is pretty conservative, that you're going to increase the present value of lifetime earnings by about $45,000, okay? And you know, this trade-off between project-based public housing and regular Section 8 housing vouchers, you know, you get these benefits in terms of additional costs. Housing economists that I talk to, they all sort of say that, you know, if anything, using Section 8 housing vouchers and running that program is a little cheaper than running project-based public housing. So switching from, you know, providing assistance in the form of these, you know, especially high-rise public housing over to housing vouchers, you're picking up these earnings gains for kids, and you're not really generating additional costs to the system as well, right, in terms of this other form of assistance. And then, you know, that's just, this number is just lifetime earnings gains using the point estimates from, you know, the treatment effects on earnings. But, you know, if you're the policymaker, you care about all of the benefits of switching and moving kids out of low-income areas using vouchers. And so I'm showing you that there's this reduction in violent crime arrests. Okay, we care a lot about violent crime arrests. They're very socially costly. And so that's, again, you know, moving us in favor of, you know, saying that maybe we want to think about expanding these voucher programs relative to using project-based public housing. All right, so thank you. That's all I have. I'm happy to take questions and chat with people about the paper, but thank you for all your time and comments.
You thought about mechanisms.
In the following sense, that one way I could think about the neighborhood effects that you're identifying is that the moves to the lower poverty neighborhoods mean that young people have less interaction with the criminal justice system, and as a consequence, their labor market trajectory will improve. Similarly, if I don't know, maybe there's something about teen fertility, pregnancy and the like. I don't know if you've tried to look at those types of channels.
Yeah, so I don't have access to data. You know, the ideal. I mean, you know, one thing to try to look at for teen pregnancy would be, you know, Medicaid claims records, and I don't have access to that. But I think the first point that you mentioned, which is about criminal justice system and how does that sort of fit into the results? I mean, you know, when I look at the sort of results I find, and then also in light of Brian's original work, Brian didn't find a lot of impacts on schooling outcomes. People didn't really move to better schools, and you didn't really see an impact on test scores or anything like that. And you know, in terms of interpreting where are the effects coming from, I think that the fact that these kids are less likely to be arrested for violent crime, they're, you know, less likely then to be incarcerated. I don't have the incarceration data, but you know, just because they're less likely to be arrested probably means they're less likely to be incarcerated for violent crime, and then, you know, that just implies that some of these labor market effects just are coming because they're not incarcerated.
And they're not stigmatized.
They're not stigmatized either by that as well, right? Yeah, exactly. So
I think it'd be fascinating if there was some way to pursue that in the subcommittee.
yeah, I mean,
I don't know if it's possible.
right? Yeah, the data is already is already a challenge for. I mean, working with administrative data always has all these challenges. But yeah, I really do interpret this paper a lot in terms of the criminal justice element and the violent crime aspect, and that's linked to sort of labor market outcomes. Yeah.
So, I mean, it seems pretty convincing that when these people move to lower poverty neighborhoods, it's a net win for them.
Right.
What was the impact on the neighborhoods that they moved to? Were there any like changes there for the outcomes of the residents before versus after?
You know, so I'm not aware of anybody that's done an individual level data analysis of that. That's fairly high in terms of the data requirements of tracking people over time and looking at what's going on in the neighborhoods that these people move to. There has been a lot of concern about that. Like that for sure is something like, you know, if you even today, if you type in on Google News, you type in like Section 8 housing vouchers, people are very concerned about people who use Section 8 housing vouchers and move to new neighborhoods and what possible impact it has on them. I think Stephen, did you have a student who?
Yeah, so Joel Hunter went to Loyola Chicago, actually, that's his job.
Yeah. So there's one recent paper, I think he finds that there's sort of parental responses.
Yeah, so the conclusion of this particular paper was that the estimated neighborhood effects from the consequence of people being displaced to the neighborhoods is small, but it's because parents respond.
Okay. Yeah. So that's one part of the analysis. Some people have done some analysis looking at impacts on neighborhood crime rates. I can't remember in detail what those results are. I think that they see some displacement of crime into new areas, just looking at crime rates, you know, like neighborhood crime rates. But I can't really speak to the precise magnitude of what those effects are.
That would also be a case for the violent and property crime distinction is very important, because one of the arguments about very disadvantaged neighborhoods is, crudely speaking, they're in a bad equilibrium with respect to violent crime. It's what the sociologist Elijah Anderson called the code of the street.
Right.
And so there's no necessarily entailment that violent crime would go up if you move a disadvantaged person to a lower poverty neighborhood.
Yeah, and I think you know, just on this topic of discussion, one thing to think about too is, you know, if there's sort of economies of scale, agglomeration effects, and criminal activity, you know, even if you displace some crime from, you know, if some crime goes up in neighborhoods that people move to, maybe that, you know, is outweighed by some sort of reduction in crime overall in the city because, you know, public housing projects had such high crime rates themselves, and if there's sort of these agglomeration effects, you could actually reduce sort of total crime in the city as a result of these like shifts across place. Yes.
So when you think about moving opportunity, people are leaving an area, but then that area is remaining like
Yeah.
impoverished. So you can imagine like trying to move everyone out of that somehow. Like, what would like be like the end game then, like from a policy point of view? Because like right now, what we see in Chicago with housing with Section 8 vouchers is like very segregated use of the vouchers. Like there's certain neighborhoods that attract a lot of them, and there's landlords who directly are targeting Section 8 people.
You know, I think I don't know enough about sort of, you know, in my data, I have tried to look at this sort of clustering thing, right? Like, do people all sort of move to the same area? I actually see a lot of variation. I mean, people on average are moving to these better neighborhoods in the city of Chicago. That is, their lower crime and et cetera. But I don't really see a lot of clustering in my data, just because this is like, maybe this is like the first wave of demolition. Section 8 housing vouchers hadn't been given out in a while, so maybe there was, you know, not this whole equilibrium of certain landlords trying to rent out their entire building to people or something. In my data, I don't really see a lot of this clustering evidence. I guess
That is happening.
Right. I've heard that, right, and so I'm not, I guess, like an expert on recent literature and what they find about that. I guess you know, one concern with that, and maybe this is not exactly what your question is that, you know, if you sort of have this sorting pattern where everybody takes their Section 8 housing voucher and now they just like live in a new concentrated low poverty area that's just private market housing, you've not really done anything to change it, concentration of poverty. You know, that's a concern, but I think, you know, I guess what I think about this usually is with Section 8 housing vouchers, there's probably still not like high rise, high density sort of project-like environment sort of replicating themselves in the private market. I guess like that's one thing I usually think about in terms of like the policy trade-offs here between using Section 8 housing vouchers and project-based public housing.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you for all your comments.